Good morning. My name is Kim Gilbert, and I'll be your instructor for Intro to Psychology this next 12 weeks. I apologize that my previous mini lecture was not working. Not quite sure what happened, but I'm going to go ahead and record another mini lecture for you, and hopefully this one will work a little bit better. In Chapter 1, we really talk about a lot of the different history of psychology. When we talk about psychology, we're talking about looking at the way that people do things. Quite a while ago, there have been researchers that have discussed different aspects of psychology. Your book first talks a little bit about the different individuals that are responsible for some of the different theories, dating all the way back to Socrates, who talked about introspection. And when we look at introspection, we're talking about your ability to look inside you or to understand yourself. Most individuals that go into counseling or go into the psychology field usually have an ability to do that. Some of the other theorists that are important to remember would be Freud. He came up with the psychoanalytical theory, and he really had quite a few other interesting tidbits. A lot of his stuff is very valid. Unfortunately, he decided to talk a little bit too much about sex and how our unconscious motives are related to sex. And a lot of times people said, okay, that's enough. He just doesn't have a lot of credibility. But his theory is based on the unconscious mind or unconscious thought, the motives. And then also what happened to you as a child or as an infant. He has a psychosexual stages, and he believes that if you had issues within any of those stages, that could probably be the reason you have a mental illness as an adult. I'm just checking to see what other theories I want to talk about. Actually, next week we'll talk quite a bit about the developmental theorists in detail, but let's talk a little bit about research. Obviously, it's important. There are two different types of research. There's applied research and there's pure research. And pure research is just a person that's decided they want to know something about something. And so they've decided that they're going to come up with a hypothesis, they're going to test it, and find out what happens. Now, applied research would be more you have a problem or you know of an issue going on within our society and you want to know what's causing it, what could help it. A lot of times you're going to see applied research with the different pharmaceutical companies. They're looking at what kind of medication can help whatever, whether it's mental illness, whether it's a physical illness. And so those are the two different types of research. Both are important, but the applied research is more specific. I have a problem or I want to figure out a problem, and so I'm going to do some research to figure out what's causing it and what I could do for that. Research, obviously we're going to use a scientific method. If you've had any science class previous to this, you're probably familiar with that. It begins with a hypothesis. We have to decide how we're going to prove or disprove it. You can use case study assessments. Your book talked about surveys, about observations. And so those are some different ways. Experiments would be different ways that you could gather information to determine whether your theory or your hypothesis is true. Let's see. Oh, correlation. I wouldn't get too embedded in correlation and the negatives and positives. Probably the most important thing that I like students to remember is that correlation does not mean causation. So you could have a positive correlation or you could have a negative correlation, but it doesn't mean that one causes the other. For example, we could say that video games, a sustained amount of time on video games creates violence in children. So we have a positive, so a lot of the time, plus the result is too much violence. We have a plus and a plus, so that's a positive correlation. But we can't say that video games cause that violent behavior because there's so many other things that could play into that. let's see, a negative correlation would be I choose to stay in bed 1 hour later, and I'm able to stay up later at night. Sorry, it's hard to come up with a negative correlation. Does it mean that because I stay in bed longer that I can, remember plus, it goes up, it's like a teeter-totter, that I can stay up later? We can't say that that's causing it. It could be so many different things. So it doesn't matter whether it's a negative correlation or a positive correlation. We cannot say that for sure that there is causation. And so that's something I want to make sure that you remember, because so many times we can see a positive correlation or negative correlation, and someone makes the assumption, see, I told you if it wasn't for that, that wouldn't cause that within our society. Let's see, Chapter 2 talks a lot about the brain. And so there are, I'm just checking my notes here to see, probably page 36 is going to be one that you're going to want to look at, so that you can review the different types of or parts of the brains and their functions. We have the pituitary gland, which is going to secrete hormones that's going to regulate our body functions. And really the pituitary gland is considered the master gland. Then you're going to have the hypothalamus, which is going to secrete the hormones that activate the pituitary gland to make sure that the master gland or the pituitary gland is working like it should. The hypothalamus is usually where you see the drives, hunger, sex, and aggression. If there is an injury to this part of the brain, that's usually where we see issues. Very common to hear of somebody who has sustained a brain injury and becomes more aggressive. That's usually because they had some sort of stress or injury to that hypothalamus. The corpus callosum are where basically that's the bridge that's going to separate the two hemispheres of the brain. We have the cerebrum, and that's where thinking and language comes from. It's also referred to as the executive center. And then finally the thalamus, which is really kind of the post office. It's the thalamus's job to relay all the information. So that's just kind of a quick overview of 1 and 2. And I hope that we're able to hear this, and I really sincerely apologize that there were so many issues with the first one. I will see you again. Thank you.